Okay. Hang on. It is. Hang on. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out which
It doesn't
screen.
matter. As many times as you practice, when you get to the real
Oh,
deal,
I know. I know.
it's like,
Well,
where
it's
was that button?
no, I found the button. It's just it's not it's not the screen I want to be sharing. It's not showing what so I want to share my oh, never mind. No, never mind. It's fine. I'm getting confused. All right. Here we go. So, can people see my screen?
Yes, we can. We're good.
Okay, so you see the slides because
Mhm.
I can't see anybody. So, well, I guess that folks are way over here on my monitor. Okay, well, anyway, welcome everybody. It's really great to see so many of you, and I really appreciate your interest in my dissertation. And this is the focus of my dissertation. So I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to try and do this as efficiently as I can, but I've practiced this several times, and it takes about 50 minutes to get through everything. Let me say a little bit about how I ended up in this topic. In my consulting work, I had doing a lot of sort of community engagement and multi-sector work, and so I was becoming very interested in moving that way, and really began to realize that in order to really bring about transformational change, we had to really think differently about the issues that we were trying to address. So, so when I got into the SABRC program, I started doing, researching the literature on multi-sector transformational change, which is actually a relatively new concept, and there really wasn't a lot of literature. So I started digging more, and then I discovered transformative learning theory, the whole idea about how we transform our perspectives, and began to realize that I needed to really focus at the individual level. Um, so that's how I ended up on this topic of looking at what happens during dialogue that makes transformative learning possible. Um, and I was hoping, I'm sure those of you who are in the field of organization development know the statistic about the success of, or the failure, I should say, of change efforts, which is about 70% failure, which is terrible. So I was hoping to come up with a way that might, or come up with something that might help. The other thing is that I have been involved with the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation for many, many years. And when I got into Saybrook and I started getting into transformative learning theory, I became involved with the Transformative Learning Network. And it just boggled my mind that there was absolutely no connection between those two, despite the fact that transformative learning theory uses dialogue as a means for reaching perspective transformation. So I'm hoping that this work will begin to start bridging that divide. Um, so that, in a nutshell, was where I was coming from and why I was embarking on this particular research. Okay, so these are my research questions. And what I want to do, I'm going to try and not read from my side, so I'll let you folks read it. What I want to do is explain a little bit about grounded theory for those of you who are not familiar with it. Grounded theory is a research methodology that um, basically you're trying to develop a theory from the data. So essentially you allow the data to tell you what what it is that you're discovering. So it's a very emergent process. And I chose this methodology specifically because it's that whole idea of allowing ideas and solutions and whatever to emerge is what I ask my clients to do. And so I thought it would be really good practice for me to experience that. And I did. And I'll probably say more about that as we get into it. The other thing that was really interesting with grounded theory is that you enter into it, or you try and enter into it without any preconceived notions, which is hard to do. I mean, we all have our biases, and that's part of the work of a researcher, is to recognize what those are. And I actually wrote about those in my dissertation. But sometimes in this process, you don't necessarily answer the questions specifically. I mean, I did definitely on my primary. The secondary ones was not quite so direct, but there were other things that popped up that I'll talk about, and in particular, this whole idea of insight and also storytelling, which I'll go into more detail later. So this is a design of my research. There were several phases. So there were two dialogues that were part of this, the research. The first was the dialogue that I participated in. And I did pre-dialogue interviews and post-dialogue interviews. I asked all the participants, including myself, to maintain a reflection journal. So for me, I would do a section, because I was wearing the hat of researcher and the hat of participant. I would do a section in the journal researcher. So it was those reflections and observations, and then participant. And I would try and keep those separate as best I could. Not always possible, but and I also had the dialogue videotaped. And then phase two, I was the facilitator of the dialogue. So I got to play both roles. And again, I did the same process with the interviews, before and after, reflection journals, and videotaping. From that, I started my analysis. And so in grounded theory, one of the things that you do is you develop categories, sort of different topics that are coming out of the data. And you're trying to make sure that those categories are what they call saturated, meaning there's no new information coming in. And if you have some key categories that aren't, then you need to go back and do theoretical sampling. So you go back and gather more information so that you get that category saturated. Typically in grounded theory, you would just go interview more people. Someone that a lot of you folks may be familiar with, who uses grounded theory a lot in her research, is Brene Brown, who did, Daring to Lead and Daring Greatly. I can't remember all them. She's got a whole bunch of books out. But anyway, so because of the design of my research, sort of a closed process. I went back to my participants, and the category that came out as not saturated was around reflection. And actually I had 100% response. Everybody responded. So that was really great. And then what I ultimately did is I developed an emerging theory. I wrote a paper on it, and then I engaged experts in the process to get their feedback. So I sent the paper to the experts. I interviewed experts from dialogue and experts from transformative learning. And then I was able to take that data and ultimately develop my, I want to say in air quotes, final grounded theory. I mean, it's a theory, and it will evolve. So that's design in a nutshell. This is a timeline just to give you a sense. And there are several things that popped up for me. One was, oh my God, I never knew how hard recruitment was going to be. But I did get it done. But it was very challenging. And the other thing that came up here was the data preparation. So I used Atlas TI as my data analysis software. And so I had to get the data prepared to get it in to Atlas. And that took like a month and a half. I mean, it was a huge amount of work, but it was great because then, once you have it in the software, the analysis becomes, I wouldn't say easy, but easier. And so then in grounded theory, there are 3 levels of coding. So the initial coding is just like breaking the data down into little pieces. And then focus coding is trying to pull it back together into those categories. And then the theoretical coding is where you get to an even more abstract level. And then ultimately, as you can see, going through the timeline, by May to July, I was doing the expert interviews, and then finally got my final theory generation in July and was able to submit my first draft to my committee in August. I have to say, I am so thankful and grateful that I was able to get the in-person work done before the pandemic. I don't know what I would have done. I would have had to completely rethink. So I feel very lucky with that. Okay, so what I want to do is talk a little bit about the differences between the two dialogues, because a number of my findings popped up out of looking at the differences between the two. So dialogue one, the topic of dialogue one was learning across cultural differences. And when you think about it, that's a very personal topic. We did have people of color as part of the, as participants. And, it's a kind of topic where you have to focus on, your own interactions, your own thinking. In dialogue two, we focused on the topic of affordable housing, and dialogue two was conducted in this area where I live. And as is true for probably many communities around the country, affordable housing is a huge issue. It's been a huge issue for a long time here, and it's just becoming even bigger. But because of a variety of things that I'll talk about shortly, the folks who participated were not people who needed affordable housing. And that was a problem. And so it made the topic more, more communal, more distant from personal experience. So the dialogue one was conducted in the living room of someone's home. That was an ideal setting, I have to say. It was really great. It created a really comfortable atmosphere. For the dialogue that I facilitated, I did it in libraries for two main reasons. One, I could reserve these rooms for free. But the other is I live outside of the sort of central core of this area. And I didn't really want to ask people to drive all the way to my house. I thought that was asking too much of people. And I also, I have pets, and it just wasn't conducive to having it here. Although at times I wish I had. So, it was a little more of a formal, I don't want to say formal, but it wasn't this super comfortable setting. In fact, the second session of dialogue two, we had a number of people interrupting our session, coming into the room and then going, oh, sorry. So it was a little frustrating in that way. And so, again, going back to dialogue one, the participants in dialogue one collectively had more experience in dialogue than the participants in dialogue two. And as you'll see when I get into it, that made a difference in terms of how much in depth they went with the dialogue. On dialogue one, we did it on a weekend, which I think in a lot of ways was the best choice. On dialogue two, we did it on weekdays for a couple of reasons. One, it met the videographer's schedule, but also initially I had hoped to work with an intact work group that was focusing on the issue of affordable housing. So I was figuring, well, it's part of their work. They could do it on weekdays, and the videographer doesn't want to work on weekends. So, but that kind of fell through. And so that eliminated part of the population that was really critical to have at that dialogue. Dialogue one, again, was mainly female, and that was significant. The dialogue two was mainly male. Dialogue 1, it was a really range of ages. Dialogue 2, because it was on a weekday, it was mainly seniors who were pretty much all retired. 2 of the people were employed, two out of 7. And then again, Dialogue 1, people were mainly employed. So those are the differences. So let me do a summary of the findings. So the big piece for that came up was this whole idea of insight. And this came up initially when I was talking to my chair about a particular situation that had happened. And this was from watching the videos. So to let you know, I actually watched the videos of each dialogue 5 times. And there was this one particular situation where it seemed like the person was having what Jack Mesereau, uh, the person who developed transformative learning theory, what he calls a disorienting dilemma, which is you sort of bump up against new information or have an experience that really challenges the way you see things. And so I was talking to her about it, saying, it's interesting. It seemed like she experienced a disorienting dilemma, but it never went anywhere. And my chair said, well, maybe it was more a moment of insight. I mean, I don't know, I don't know if she used moment of insight, but she did say insight. So I started looking into the literature, and that's something that happens with grounded theory, is this other things come up that I had not done any literature review on. So I had to start digging back into the literature. So it became clear as I was tracking this in the videos that that insight followed by critical self-reflection, sort of questioning your thinking, is necessary, but it's not enough to get to a perspective transformation. So that was one of the key findings that came up. And as I mentioned earlier, gender and experience with dialogue, the numbers that I had, there were 5 participants in the first dialogue and 7 in the second, are clearly not statistically significant, but there appeared to be an influence in terms of females were more likely to be more effective with dialogue than males. And I based some of that, on the data, but also on Deborah Tannen's work around gender differences, particularly in communications. So there was this difference, and that obviously those with more experience were more likely to experience insight and critical self-reflection, as well as women. Now, the other thing that came up, I mentioned earlier, was storytelling. And what I identified were 2 different types of storytelling. The first, which is listed on the first bullet, is personal storytelling. So personal storytelling is telling stories about yourself or about things that you were involved with, that you were related to. And vicarious storytelling is telling stories that you don't have a connection to. So maybe you read it somewhere or you heard it from someone else. So personal storytelling, basically, and I witnessed this several times, it created connection amongst the participants. And it also had a tendency to equalize power, that there was when you're personal storytelling, you're really sharing your power, and you're opening yourself up to being vulnerable. Vicarious storytelling was just the opposite, that usually when people are vicarious storytelling, they're establishing expertise, and so they're establishing a certain level of power, or maintaining it, and it's a shield in a lot of ways of looking inward and allowing oneself to be vulnerable. So personal storytellers were more likely to experience moments of insight than those who were telling vicarious stories. Um, and then the next piece, and again, I'll explain this, premise reflection. So there were, again, going back to transformative learning theory, Jack Mesereau describes or defines 3 different types of reflection. The first is content reflection, which is essentially what it says. You know, you're looking at what the content is. You're just, you know, so maybe you're just sort of learning about it, or you're just repeating it, or whatever. Process reflection is looking at processes, looking at how we go about doing things, and you know, questioning, are we doing things in an effective way? Premise reflection is reflecting on the premise of whatever it is you're doing. So, or, you know, looking at the paradigm and really questioning whether that needs to change. So Mesereau basically states that in order to have perspective transformation, you have to engage in premise reflection. So obviously, that was a critical piece to look at in this study. And what I found out, and to a certain extent, I mean, some of these things, I look at them and say, well, gosh, these are all no-brainers. But what I found was that my participants were more likely to engage in premise reflection in the dialogue in person than they were in their reflection journals. And to a certain extent, that makes a lot of sense, because premise reflection is difficult. And it's easier to do it collectively with other people, to have other people asking about your perspective and trying to understand and trying to present a different perspective and challenging you perhaps about thinking differently. So again, that makes a lot of sense. And then another piece that came up was this idea of dissonance and curiosity. So Mesereau will say that when someone experiences a disorienting dilemma, they experience discomfort and lack of control. What I found, particularly in dialogue 1, is that people, and again, I think this has to do with the level of experience with dialogue, it was more likely to be dissonance, that it was like, well, that doesn't really jive. But then curiosity. So what does that mean? Like, how do I make meaning of that? How do I get to come to terms with this? So, and I'll talk more about this later, because this creates a whole different path to perspective transformation. And then the other thing that I discovered was that my participation in the dialogue, in the research, was incredibly important. In fact, I would not have come up with some of these findings without it. And again, I'll talk to that more later. But I think, you know, again, you get a greater understanding of the processes that are going on, and obviously a certain level of empathy. Okay, so here's the grounded theory. And I'm gonna have to get a little closer. It's really tiny on my laptop screen, so I may be looking over a lot more. What I did was I started out, well, and actually before I jump into it, let me just say that what is on this diagram is what is reflected in the data. Now, you could add a lot of other things. In fact, my chair had suggested a few things, and I said, don't disagree with you, but that wasn't in the data, and I need to reflect the data. So, so obviously this whole, you know, grounded theory can be expanded and built on, but this is what the data reflected. So I started with current state of mind, and it was really important that people enter into the dialogue with curiosity, you know, emotional maturity, and feeling, and of course, psychological safety is something you build, but feeling like there was, you know, that this was going to be a safe space, that people had a certain level of readiness to learn and to change, and that they were willing to be vulnerable. So that's kind of setting the stage for a productive dialogue. And then as you move into dialogue, people are establishing connections, developing relationships. And what supports this process is, people being authentic, being present. So being present, I basically made everybody turn their phones off. I didn't want them on buzz. I didn't want people being distracted at all. And everybody was, very willing to oblige. I think they really understood the importance of that. Obviously, diversity of perspectives, and empathy, inquiry. So really, this is one of those dialogue skills that is important that people, if they've not engaged in a lot, that they get some practice with it, but really asking about other people's perspectives as a means for understanding. I often say, listen to understand, not to debate. Um, and then, of course, the personal storytelling was part of that, having respect for one another, sharing power. I mentioned that already. Sharing a meal, can't tell you how important that was. Before all of these sessions, we sat down and had lunch together. And then during the break, we had snacks and stuff. But it was just a really wonderful opportunity to start getting to know each other and starting to develop those relationships. And sometimes I think this is overlooked by organizations and communities. It's, well, we can't spend the money, et cetera. It's money well spent. So, and then of course, trust, which is something that develops through feeling that there's psychological safety. So at some point, people will experience that dissonance or discomfort. And, when they do that, they're often feeling challenged. And there are different perspective shift catalysts. And I've mentioned the disorienting dilemma that Mesereau describes it as epical. It's a big thing. So, for example, getting a terminal cancer diagnosis, that's a huge disorienting dilemma. There's three of these, is an accumulation of changed meaning schemes. So I'll explain what that is. So meaning schemes are these, they're like the building blocks of our meaning system. And there are beliefs with respect to particular situations. And those little meaning schemes, they come together to create our whole, meaning system and how we see the world. But those will change over time. And ultimately, when you get enough of these accumulated changes, you then are able to shift your perspective. It's sort of like reaching a tipping point, but they can take quite a while. And for some people, it may never happen. And then the other thing I found, and I discovered this through the pre-dialogue interviews, was personal connection, that a lot of people talked about feeling challenged and considering their current perspective when they were engaged in a dialogue with someone they knew fairly well. So a family member, coworker, supervisor, things like that. And so those were the three that I discovered there. So hopefully, if all is going well, the individual will experience insight. And what plays into this is, the first is proprioception of thought. And again, I will explain that. So proprioception is our ability to know where our body is at any point in time. So, I'm putting my hand over my head. I know my hand is over my head. I know my hands are in my lap right now. I know my legs are crossed. Proprioception of thought is a concept that David Bohm developed in his work on dialogue. And it's the idea that we're able to see our thinking, to be able to step back and realize this is what we were thinking. And I actually experienced that in the dialogue I participated in. And it was really, of course, it took me the fifth time through watching the video to go, oh, oh yeah, right, that's what was happening. And actually, I've now been practicing mindfulness for 6 years, and I credit my mindfulness practice to it, that there's this, in mindfulness, you observe your thinking, you try and focus on your breathing, and then your mind wanders off, and then you realize that's what you're doing, and you bring your thought back. So there's this practice of trying to observe your thinking, and it's really a critical piece to be able to see that. And I was able to see, we were talking about um, accommodation and assimilation, and one of the participants said, well, you know, it depends on what side you're on. And I just thought about that and went, oh, 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 so I'm always seeing this from the dominant culture. I'm always thinking from this perspective, and that's limiting my thinking. So, what have I been able to do a lot with it? No, I've been able to recognize it when it happens more and more now, but um, yeah, I mean, it's a start to shifting your perspective. So that's a critical piece with insight. Um, Insight is also, as anybody knows, I mean, insight is that aha moment. And anybody who's had an aha moment knows that you feel it in your body. So it's an embodied experience. And so there's psychomotor learning involved in that. And then clearly having self-awareness um, is an important piece, and being able to use insight to move beyond your current perspective. And so, as I said, the idea is that insight needs to be followed with critical self-reflection, sort of as it says here, challenging the status quo. And then the premise reflection. Uh, so um, you're making meaning of what just happened. And then what follows is affective learning, which is learning through your emotional senses, so attitudes, emotions, feelings that are listed there. And also triple loop learning. So let me explain single, double, and triple loop learning for those who've not heard of this before. um, you can sort of um, connect them to content, process, and premise reflection. They're not identical, but there's a connection between those. So single loop learning is really, and I'm going to use this from a systems perspective, it's basically learning how the system works, learning how to make things, be more effective at what is currently happening within the system, the way the system works. It has nothing to do with changing the system. um, Double loop learning is, you can liken it to the process reflection, where you're looking at processes. So how, again, it's looking within the system. How can we improve the system? How can we change these particular processes so that we're getting better outcomes? Triple loop learning is, again, it's connected to premise reflection. And it's really basically saying, how do we completely redesign the system? Because the system isn't working for us. We're not getting the outcomes we want. So we need to redesign the system. So that's what triple loop learning is. And it was interesting for me because I did some searching on transformative learning literature, on the various journals that transformative learning literature is published in typically. And I searched on triple loop learning, and there were very, very few references. And I was really surprised at that. Um, and I think that that's a very important piece. So ultimately, you're engaging in effective learning, triple loop learning, and your perspective transforms. And then ultimately that transformed perspective becomes your current perspective, and then you're sort of set up for the next cycle. And so that's why this is set up as a cycle. Okay, so the other thing that came out of the data was what I'm calling a counter theory. And I describe this as a cautionary tale. It's really red flags for facilitators. If these things are happening in your dialogue, you need to step back and try and figure out what's going on, because these are really problematic pieces. So again, you have your current perspective, you bump up against new information, and a lot of us will do this without thinking or without intending, but we try and make things fit within what our current perspective is. So you might be judgmental, coming in with certainty about your own perspective really closes you off to new information. Um, some people are deceitful. I certainly didn't see that, but that that concept popped up. Some people get frustrated. They don't know what to do with the new information. If there's a lot of like-mindedness, then it's really easy to sort of circle the wagons and say, oh, no, that doesn't fit. And then obviously making assumptions, which we all do all the time. And the real key to effective dialogue is being able to recognize when you're doing that and then challenge it. And so, again, some of these things that happen are very innocent. But in that sort of frame of mind that I've just described, then there's this effort to maintain power and control. And sometimes it's done through anger. Sometimes people conflate experiences. So someone might say, oh, well, I understand what you're saying because I experienced this. And it's like, no, those are apples and oranges. But again, that's a reasonable thing to try and do. But it can create barriers to really opening up. And obviously fear, shame, and then, as I mentioned, vicarious storytelling. So, and that attempt to maintain, the status quo often brings about this inability to accommodate the new information. And, people will be argumentative, they'll be opinionated, they'll engage in confirmation bias, basically seeing what they want to see that confirms their point of view, and sort of disregarding the rest. And then there's often misunderstanding. And again, misunderstanding is often very, very unintentional and innocent. But again, that inability then hampers people's learning. There are often counterproductive dialogic processes going on. People can be defensive, and then people engage in what is referred to as homophilia, which is basically, it's the whole idea of like-mindedness. It's engaging or being around people who are very much like you, and not engaging with people who are different from you. And then that just reinforces the current perspective. And again, this becomes kind of a vicious cycle. So that was my counter theory that came out of the data. So I want to talk a little bit about how my work expanded or is expanding transformative learning theory. So I'm referring to this type of dialogue as intentional dialogue, that people are entering this dialogue intentionally with the purpose of trying to surface and challenge their own assumptions. And I see it as an alternative path to perspective transformation. So on one end, you've got the disorienting dilemma, which can be really risky and can often, if it fails in a big way. And then you've got the accumulation of change meeting schemes, which, as I said, is a very slow process. So for me, intentional dialogue is the in-between. It's safer and more measured than disoriented dilemma. But it doesn't take the kind of time. I mean, again, if people put the time they need into it, it doesn't take the kind of time of, sort of the slow moving accumulation of meaning schemes. And then I already talked about the idea of dissonance and curiosity versus discomfort and lack of control, that if people can get to that point, I think dialogue will be way more effective. Obviously, when you're experiencing discomfort and lack of control, it's not easy in that kind of situation to be open to new ideas. You're probably going into a defensive mode. So if it's just dissonance, it's like, that doesn't quite jive, and I wonder why. I think that's a much more effective frame of mind to be coming from. And then I talked about storytelling, personal versus vicarious, and I talked about the moments of insight, and also the effective learning and triple loop learning. So those are things that I believe I've added to transformative learning theory. Now, um, I have a whole bunch of recommendations. These are coming right out of my dissertation, the final chapter. Um, so I was able to divide the recommendations into three different areas: skills and knowledge that are important. I wouldn't say necessary, but are important for facilitators to try and gain at least some experience with, and then processes and practices that they can engage in, and then recommendations for project leaders and how to support a dialogic and a systemic process. So for the skills and knowledge, it's really helpful for people to understand the different approaches to dialogue. You know, a lot of people refer to Bohmian dialogue, David Bohm's form of dialogue, but it doesn't work in a lot of situations. And so my feeling is, if you understand different ways of approaching dialogue, you can adapt what it is you need for the given situation. Um, and I think it's really important for people to understand, have a basic understanding of complexity and chaos theories. Just, you know, how that impacts the way people interact when dealing with complex problems. You know, the whole, I'll mention this when talking about project leaders, but the whole idea of uncertainty and unpredictability. Um, anyway, so, and then having some understanding of adult development, and I specifically focused on constructive developmental theory, which is developed by Robert Keegan, that it's really important to understand where people are at developmentally and how to meet them there. And ultimately, I don't want to say help them, because that's not really but provide a setting in which they can choose to try and move beyond where they are. You know, that, uh, people have to make that choice themselves. All we as facilitators can do is really create the conditions for it and support them. And then, of course, I mentioned single, double, and triple loop learning. Important to understand power differentials impact on dialogue. That Bohm will basically say that true dialogue happens amongst peers. You know, in an organizational setting, that can be difficult, and it's really important to be aware of those differences. I talked about content process and premise reflection and personal vicarious storytelling. And, I will wholeheartedly admit that uh, while I was facilitating my dialogue, I didn't necessarily recognize moments of insight. I might be more aware of it now, um, but to be able to actually recognize and leverage those. And I have to say, I actually think, and again, you have to have people comfortable with this idea, but actually videotaping dialogues and then using that as a way to process together, I think it would be a great tool. Um, it's something that I actually hope to do in another venue, which I'll talk about it in a bit. And then having lived experience in dialogue and the topic is definitely helpful. You don't have to be an expert, but just so you have this basic understanding. Okay, so processes and practices. I think it's really important to do as much assessment as you can prior to the dialogue, so you have an idea of where your participants are coming from. Doesn't have to be formal, although it can be, but how ready are they? What level of adult development? What kind of level of emotional intelligence? Those are all assessments that you can do. Um, One of the things I found out, and again, it's the difference between the two dialogues and the level of experience people had with dialogue, that it's really important to teach dialogue skills. I had not thought about that, nor had I built in time for that. But I think that that's a critical piece. If you've got people who've never really engaged much in a dialogue, then it's important to start slowly and give them the tools they need to be effective. Um, Again, I've talked about mindfulness. I'm thinking about, when I do dialogues, of starting, with a moment of mindfulness. Doesn't have to be very long, but just giving people an opportunity to settle their thoughts and be present. Um, and I think it's incredibly important to build in the time for building trust, developing the relationships, and creating psychological safety, because it's not, without that, it's not going to go anywhere. Um, Obviously, pay attention to the physical environment. I've talked about that. And allowing oneself to be vulnerable and demonstrating it. I think often facilitators can go a long way by being the first one to make themselves vulnerable. And then they're demonstrating to the rest of the participants that this is okay, and this is what is expected. Obviously, creating opportunities for personal storytelling. Now, uh, one of the dialogue experts said to me, well, storytelling is not dialogue. And that's true. You're stepping out of dialogue when there's storytelling, but I think it's fine to sort of step out for that moment and come back in. And it's an important piece of that building that connection. Um, obviously taking advantage of moments of insight, as I said, easier said than done. The other thing is building in right-brained activities. Insight actually, it comes from your right brain, not your creative side, not your logical side. Um, so having right-brained activities, I usually um, uh, start and end sessions with different activities, just to engage people differently, and to engage their brains differently. And obviously integrate the three domains of learning, affective, cognitive, and psychomotor into the dialogue, willingness to share power. Um, and then the final piece I think is really important for facilitators do, which is basically to work themselves out of a job. It's really important that you develop a participant group to the point where they can continue to maintain their dialogue on their own and they don't need you. They will be able to do much more in terms of solving their own problems if they are able to engage in a dialogic process regularly without the help of a facilitator. Okay, and recommendations for project leaders. So have tolerance with uncertainty and ambiguity. I have bumped up against so many funders who in their, your grant applications want to know exactly what the outcomes are going to be. And I always want to say, well, if we knew that, don't you think we would have already done that? So when you're dealing with complex issues, there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity, but there's an intentional process that's going on and it's emergent. And so the next bullet, leaders need to be patient with what is often a very messy process. Again, this willingness to share power, this willingness to be vulnerable, to model the behaviors that you want participants to engage in. And it really helps if project leaders have some real basic understanding of these different topics. Um, again, it will just help them support the process better and, you know, provide unwavering support. As soon as they start to waver, it undermines the whole process. And then the next one is a really huge challenge, which is providing the necessary time and resources. A lot of organizations and communities don't want to really engage in dialogue because they don't feel like they have the time to do it. My response is, you don't have the time not to do it. It's the only way you're going to be able to really address some of these complex problems effectively. And then last is, supporting participants' efforts to self-organize. Okay, so they're changing the organizational chart a little bit, but that's not the end of the world. Okay, so what's next for me? Well, right now I am a participant in a grant application where and this is with actually the National Science Foundation, if it comes through, I will be facilitating dialogue between Indigenous cultural knowledge keepers and STEM faculty to basically talk about how to bring cultural science, Indigenous ways of engaging in science into STEM curriculum. So fingers crossed that comes through. I think we'll know either next month or June. And that will be really amazing. I am actually going to be a member of a plenary panel. It's the first all-female panel for the ISSS, International Society for System Sciences, for their meeting in July. I will be talking about dialogue, and one of the other members will be talking about circle method, and the other will be talking about roundtable as means for of engaging in a systems approach. I have not yet started the next bullet. This is one that I mentioned in terms of earlier. I'm trying to remember what I was saying about it. But basically, I'm hoping to do some research and develop a proposal for Dartmouth Tuck School of Business, which is just down the road from me, to create a dialogic and systemic approach to their learning. And so my idea is that we would try a pilot of student volunteers who would be part of this dialogue group, and they would stick with it for the entire 2 years that they're there. And so I have a lot of work around just researching how much a dialogic approach has been used in other business schools or even other schools, but also sort of, you know, how I would approach this. I've got a lot of notes I've made around this, but once this presentation is done, I'll probably start getting on this. Then I'm also working on several articles, and I have several books in mind. So that's what's next for me. I think I got plenty to keep me busy, but I'm always keeping my eyes open and networking with folks. Really, I'm really passionate about the idea of using dialogue as a means to bring about systems change. And then finally, I just want to, this was in my dissertation. I dedicated my dissertation to Charles. He was a really good friend of mine. We met at Saybrook and we were in classes together. I found out 3 weeks before my defense that he had passed away suddenly. And it made for a difficult time with my defense. I was not really there, but he was an amazing man. He was a very profound thinker. He and I were in a support group together for people doing their dissertation. He was also part of my mindfulness group. And I still really miss him, but I just wanted folks to know about him. And, you know, he brought a lot to this world. So I'm done. Questions?
Okay. Marty, that was great. And I've got a whole page of comments and questions
Okay.
on myself. We may have to have another call later because I'm going to start with those that have put questions in the comment box.
Okay.
And Barbara Schmidt Abbey is up first. So Barbara, I'll just let you ask your question. Is she there?
All right. Okay. Sorry, no. I think, yeah, thanks very much. And thanks so much, Marty. This was fantastic sharing your journey here with us. I had one methodological question about your dialogues with the dialogue one and dialogue two. It wasn't fully clear to me whether the dialogue one settings were with individuals, just one-to-one, or were they in small group settings? Could you explain, perhaps?
Yeah, both dialogues were in a group setting. I mean, what was one-to-one were the interviews, you know, the pre and post interviews, but we met for 2 half days at it was actually my chair's house. She's facilitated the dialogue. And so we sat around, there were 5 of us plus Nancy, sat around a coffee table. We actually didn't use the sofas. We grabbed the dining room chairs and pushed the sofas back because we were a little afraid that, you know, people were just gonna melt into the sofas. So it kept people a little more alert. I mean, we were very conscious about the physical environment. So that, yeah. And then it was, again, with dialogue 2, it was 7 participants plus me. And I have a coffee table here in my office, and I I brought it in to the library, so we'd have this low table. So yeah, that was how that was how it happened.
Great. Thank you, Barbara, for the question. Jean Bellinger, you had a question in the chat box too. You want to ask your question, or you want me to read it?
Did I have a question?
Yeah, you did. You said, unless somebody used your name, regarding no-brainers, how do you know what you know until you make it explicit?
Well, there wasn't a question.
Well, you put a question mark on the end, so
Well, okay, but it was just sort of
a comment.
a thought that came to mind.
Okay, do you want to follow that up, or?
No, just ponder it.
Okay, ponder it. Barbara Shapiro. Oh, Barbara, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Hi, Marty. This was really great. I particularly liked the insight you have about personal versus vicarious storytelling. But on this question, you make a big point, which I agree with, about in person versus not. And I wonder what you think about Zoom dialogues as opposed to in person, because it's sort of a quasi in person, but physical presence really matters. So I wonder what you think about that.
Given the pandemic, I mean, hopefully things are going to ease, but given the pandemic, we don't have a choice at the moment. But if we have choice, absolutely in person. You just cannot get the same experience. There's something about seeing a person's whole body, and there's this energy that you feel in the room. I mean, I think anybody who's done these Zoom meetings knows it's like, oh my God, I don't want to ever have to do another one. So yeah, and it'll be interesting if this grant comes through. I'm hoping that by the time I think I would be facilitating dialogues in August, I'm hoping that we will be able to do it in person. I will do it, and actually, I have a book about facilitating dialogues online, because I really would dread doing that, but yeah, in person.
Okay. Thank you, Marty. Linda Burns.
Yes, hello. Sorry, I turned off my camera because I have very busy dogs in the background.
I kicked mine out.
This, I don't even know how to pronounce it, proprioception. I've not come across this. And I was just wondering how different or similar it may be to reflective or reflexive practice.
Well, that's a good question. I'd say they're related. I've not actually given that a lot of thought, but I'm just trying to think in terms of the way Bohm describes proprioception of thought. I think that really it's, I can really just speak from my own experience, which is that, during that dialogue, we were going back and forth about, accommodating and assimilating. And then when the participants said, it depends on which side you're on, I had not really thought about it in terms of sides. But of course, I'm coming from, so it was like, I realized that was where my thinking was coming from. So that to me, that's, proprioception of thought. I mean, I think it is a reflexive practice. I think the two go hand in hand, but that's a great question. And I had not really thought about tying those two together. Although one of the things that I talk about at some point in my dissertation is the idea of building a reflexive practice into a dialogic approach, because it's important. And in organizations, just don't take the time they really need to step back and go, okay, wait a minute, let's think about what we're doing right now. And where we've been, where we're going, that sort of thing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for being here.
Linda, I think your dogs wanted to participate. It sounded like. We accept dogs and kids into these Zooms. That's been the big shift, I think, over the last year.
Oh, there's Kaylee.
So Annette Shakid, let's see, make sure you're still on.
I stayed. I'm supposed to be somewhere else, but I'm really happy to be here. Marty, great job. So my question was sort of similar to the last person's question. It was around whether you noticed anyone else in the dialogue speaking proprioceptively or sharing the movement of their thoughts from a proprioceptive space or reference point. So when I think about proprioception, where did the thought move in my body system? Like, did it move to my head? Did it move down to my heart? Like, it's like, am I aware of how I'm feeling it or sensing it in my body? And it's an unusual thing to even try to speak out to a group, let alone tap into. So I was just curious. And again, I wouldn't really expect that it came up, but I don't think we talk about this. And I know it was something that intrigued me when I first heard the word.
Well, so yeah, I mean, it's, again, I think part of the reason having researcher participation in the research, particularly in social sciences, because we're dealing with really internal processes. So I wouldn't know if any of my participants had experienced proprioception of thought unless they shared it. There was one particular participant who was questioning, so she, I think I shared this in the dissertation. She was talking about a situation with a family member, and she would say, you know, it's important for me to be in relationship. That's more important to me than being right. And then at one point, as we were moving along in the dialogue, and I can't remember exactly what happened, and she said, well, maybe I do need to be right more than in relationship. And it was like, but that's just, I think, and I'm trying, there were probably other sort of small moments. That was the biggest one that I remember seeing from another participant. And again, you know, it's possible that people might write about it in their journals, but I think I had, for both of the dialogues, I'd wish we could have gone on longer, because we would have progressed farther. And I think that may have come up more as we got, you know, into more depth and into more introspection. So, but yeah, it was hard to see, and I was glad that I experienced it.
Okay, great, thank you. Barbara Schmidt, Abby, one more question.
Oh, right, thanks. Yeah, just a quick question. This is a very practical question here. You mentioned in your recommendations for facilitators to teach dialogue skills. I was really intrigued by that, very practically. But how would one go about it? I mean, what resources would you recommend to facilitators in this regard?
I haven't totally thought that through yet, but you know, I mean, I think, and again, I don't have them committed to memory, but I identified the dialogue skills. So things like, I mean, I would want people to understand what proprioception of thought is, just for them to have a basic understanding of what you're trying to do is to catch your thinking and say, well, wait a minute, is that thinking working for me or is it not? I mean, I went into the dialogue that I participated in. So I have most of my life, unfortunately, has been spent in very white communities. You know, so I've not been exposed, other than through travel, I've not been exposed to a lot of people of color and you know, I mean, again, I've been exposed through travel to different parts of the country and to different parts of the world, and exposed to different cultures. And I've developed an appreciation for that, but I know that I have blinders, that I have assumptions that I make because of my upbringing. So I went in to this dialogue saying, I know I really want to try and uncover something here. So, you know, I think that, so that's, you know, one of those pieces of, you know, so trying to help people understand, well, what does it mean? What are we talking about when we talk assumptions? What do we mean when we say suspend our assumptions? You know, so those are, so in some ways, the dialogue may start out a little bit like a teaching session. But I think that the other piece, and again, this is where video can be really helpful. You know, I think about inquiry, that, you know, if we think about sort of the current state of political discourse in this world, it's not exactly dialogic, and people aren't exactly inquiring. So to be able to help people understand how they can reframe questions, you know, one, you know, just the simple open-ended versus closed, you know, frame open-ended questions, you know. So yeah, but I that's something in particular I'm thinking about this with respect to this proposal for the business school, is sort of how, you know, for one, I would need to know, where are these students at? You know, I'd want to be able to interview them prior to starting the dialogue, and just get a sense of who they are. And then that would give me an idea of, okay, well, here's what the needs are of the group. And then, so in some ways, I you know, I do this kind of adaptively. You know, I don't want to come up with a set, this is what we do, because you know what, you know, when you come up with a, you know, one size fits all, it doesn't fit all. So I would want to be able to develop an approach that was customized for that particular group. So I don't, it's a kind of a long answer that I'm not sure really answered your question.
Okay, thank you. So hopefully I do not really abuse this name, but I'll try my best. So Jean Bota, is it Bota?
Hey,
Now correct
hello.
me.
Johan Buerta.
Johan, okay.
Hi, Marty.
Hi, Johan.
How are you doing? You must be a little bit tired by now.
I'm still feeling energized.
Okay,
I'm one
good.
of those people, you know, you get me starting to talk about this and then you can't shut me down. You know?
Great. Then I'll get you to keep going. I was interested in how you differentiate between dialogue and the personal storytelling, specifically because I enjoyed how you separated the personal versus vicarious. And I can see how the personal really helps you gain presence and your own perspective on things. And if that's the thing we want to change, you can see how that's important. So I really felt how that is important to the process. But then at the same time, it sounded like you're saying there's a difference, and that you almost differentiated between the two somehow. But I wasn't so clear about that.
Yeah, well, so, you know, in dialogue, it's, and again, the types of dialogue I would be facilitating that I'm talking about here, intentional dialogue, you know, we're speaking to the whole, and there's a back and forth. When someone moves into storytelling, you know, in particular personal storytelling, that back and forth stops momentarily. So, you know, and I'm just remembering some of the personal stories that people told, where we just all sat there listening really intently. You know, the particular, you know, a couple of particular stories that were very moving, and you know, really, I think caused us to think. But there wasn't this back and forth, and you know, of course, you know, storytelling, Bohm wouldn't have that as part of dialogue, but but what I see in intentional dialogue is this sort of floating back and forth so, we're having this conversation about accommodation in a simulation, and then someone shares a story that's related to that, and everybody stops and listens, and then we come back, and then we're reflecting either on those concepts again, or we're reflecting on what that person just shared, and sort of tying it all together. So to me, I mean, I just see it floats, and it goes back and forth, so that it's not necessarily a distinct cutoff. But when people are storytelling, we're not engaged, we're listening, they're talking. It's not the back and forth. That's my distinction.
Okay, thank you, Marty. Lowell Christie, welcome, Lowell. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Marty, for teasing out the kind of stepwise processes. It makes it much clearer how transformative conversations operate. My question is about the difference between scale and scope. Scale being I can scale from one group to a larger group, etc. And scope is how you take the ideas of conversation to, like, the American experiment and the design of how a representative democracy is supposed to operate. And I'm a cultural anthropologist dealing with cognitive archaeology. I go back in time to reconstruct the ideosphere of a people. And it's fascinating to see the American experiment and the ideas and the supply chain that came to America was really based around this idea of transformative interaction. Transformative interaction, including dialogue, but literally how you facilitate through infrastructure, et cetera, interactions and level the playing field, et cetera. So just an example, I've identified sort of 10 transformative aspects of what I call the political alchemy of the American experiment. And one of them is about going from freedom. We got our freedom from Britain, and then we were collapsing as a country. And only by setting up the Constitution, the interaction, checks and balances, et cetera, were we able to get a dialogic structure, an interactive structure that actually put power in the people. So I was wondering if you could comment on how you could increase the scope of what you're doing to larger political configurations.
Oh, well, that's a big question.
Please give me the answer. I need it.
Well, in today's climate, I think there needs to be a real willingness to want to engage in a true dialogic process. I mean, I will say, so I live in Vermont. We have town meeting. We operate on Robert's Rules of Order. That is not a dialogic process, not at all. It's in a process that allows input, but it really doesn't go into exploring like what the root causes are of issues that we're struggling with in our community, or so, and a lot of sort of town meeting forums also, again, it's when people are standing up at a mic, it does not, I mean, I would say, first of all, dialogue starts with people sitting in a circle, so that there's, again, this is the whole idea of equalizing power. There's no head, it's sort of like the round table. But I mean, if I think about it, that I remember having this conversation with some folks that are involved with dialogue about whether or not the Biden administration would be open to dialogue. Certainly more open than the previous. But again, there's this need for people to really understand what the process really is, how it can solve, well, I don't want to say solve, how it can address some of our critical issues, and a willingness to put in the time and you know, and a desire to use that process. And I think that sort of in the political arena, there's a lot of other forces that are coming into play. You know, when I listen to media reports, I get so irritated when I hear the reporters saying, "So who's to blame for this?" You know, and it's like, what are we accomplishing by doing this? You know, we're not accomplishing anything. So again, I don't know if I'm really answering your question very well, but I think that I actually think that perhaps dialogue. I mean, I think about Margaret Mead's quote about you know, the only way change has really been brought about is by a committed group of small group of committed citizens. I think that that's really the way to make a difference, that are at the federal level and even at the state level, it's so monolithic, or, you know, maybe that's not the right word, but it's so entrenched, the whole system. Whereas maybe starting at local levels, at communities where, and actually I've had conversations with, at least with one select board member here about sort of, this is a person who is really interested in creating more community conversation. And when I heard her say that in a forum, I emailed her and said, well, you know, I'm interested in doing this kind of stuff. And then the pandemic happened. But then we got back in touch, and, you know, I basically discussed what I thought was really important and left it as, you know, I think you need to talk with our town manager, you need to talk with the select board. Whatever happens, it can't be sort of select board run, because it will not work, not in this community. It needs to be citizen run. And whether or not I can do that is, you know, I'm always a little leery about doing this kind of work in my own community, because I'm not, you know, I'm not often seen as objective, which is accurate. I'm not. I mean, I have my own, you know, my own concerns and how I want to see my community. So I don't know if that answers your question, Lowell.
I think you said the two answers. Number one being the quote from Margaret Mead, and the emphasis is upon citizenship, and we need to redefine citizenship. And number two, I would just recommend, instead of looking at business school, look at schools of journalism.
Oh, that's a good idea.
And that's where the rub comes. If it's just gotcha moments and exposés and hypocrisy revelations, that's not going to take us very far as a country.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Lowell. Alexander.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Deanna. And Marty, or sorry, Dr. Jacobs. I don't know how used to you are, how used that you are, but, you know, it takes some getting used to. Yeah, great. Congratulations, first of all. Thank you. You know how you can see already the amount of interest and the relevance that this is generating here, the interest is generating, and the relevance that portends for our world now. So I think it's very important what you're doing. I was very interested by your future directions that you want to take this in. And maybe I can just share a few things that might feed those, because I heard a lot of respectful comments about David Bohm's work, but also views of where it falls short and where you're taking this to bring this further. I could see you writing, you know, On Dialogue Revisited, or, you know, the next step. Seriously, taking stuff and bringing it into the next framing, and updating and taking forward. And not that you have to be a Bohmian for this, but just, you know, taking forward that work, I think is important. I think you're making great inroads on that. And So some things that some bees in your bonnet, nice ones. These are honeybees. They're not the kind of thing. One is to think about what you talk a lot about the relationship between insight and this process and the whole proprioceptive engagement, and insight and intuition. I think those have a nice play with them, and the ability to listen with the heart. So often, especially in our Western-oriented worlds, we analyze things, especially in dissertations and so on. We gotta think this through. How can you think it through from here, right? And what is the role also, not just from the heart, but also from the gut, the intuitional engagement, and using self as instrument. That's a big thing also at Saybrook. And how do we use self as instrument, a whole systems approach and engagement in the listening, not just the listening, but the dialogue. And so there you go with empathy and compassion and these frames. And it brings up something that a colleague of mine, David Price, talks about dialogue. I love that idea.
Dialogue.
Yeah. So he talks about, David Price writes about dialogue. So it's DAO log, right? Yeah. Dialogue and, or dialogue. I'm not quite sure how he pronounces it, but I think that this also will get to something that relates to what I'm particularly interested in your work, and that is the aspect of the collective intelligence, right? So we move from connective intelligence, knowing with whom, what ideas to connect with and so on, to collective intelligence, but that's not the objective. The objective is collective creativity and perhaps collective wisdom, right? So all of these, how do these empower those steps? And so in particular, I guess this is where I'm going with this, is some of the work, for example, of Wendy Wheeler. She wrote this book called The Whole Creature, and she talks of, this is now in the framework of Ubuntu and other engagements, where we see an emergence of a collective being. So in this frame, in the dialogic frame, clearly, you talked about your blind spots, and you talked about, how when we are with others in dialogue, they can help us see our blind spots. Right. They can help us make sense, particularly in VUCA, right? The volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world that we live in. In VUCA times, you need transdisciplinarity. You need multiple perspectives. And if you try to see everything by yourself, you're going to fall short in a VUCA environment. So really having the collective intelligence is almost a requirement for our species in this day. How do we augment that? I think that's something to explore that would be really, really, really helpful. And the idea that with, that none of us is as smart as all of us. If you can do that in the framework where yes, you said, creating the systemic nurturance space where there is trust and respect and a sense of, I am part of this, not I'm going to be burned at the stake if I say something weird. So that I think is also critical in terms of the setting up. But the final thing here, and aside from, I think, the two things you may want to explore in your next book on dialogue, David Bohm's work revisited, is dialogue is one aspect, and the other thing is collective proprioception. And what would collective proprioception be like? And of course, you need to distinguish between proprioception and interoception, which is more a physical sensing. But that's also, I think, important to think about that aspect of our more physical aspects of self-knowing. But how do we, what would be collective proprioception, and how can that really help us develop that aspect of the evolution of consciousness into collective consciousness, so that we can really live into the power of where none of us is as smart as all of us, how we can really, really tap into that through dialogic forms that bring into the sense of Ubuntu, the sense of the whole creature, the sense of the emergent being in the room, and respecting that being as an entity in and of itself, its own behavioral interests, and there are other cultural frames that are not based on strident individualism and self-righteousness in the same extent that our Western world often is. And how do we have that sense of that collective being, that Ubuntu-ness, the interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh and Charles Eisenstein write about? How can we nurture that in the collective proprioception through this kind of dialogue? Those are the things which I would love to see. This is not the question you need to answer right here, but they're
Yeah.
exploring with you this play space. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Those are great ideas. They're not, you know, I almost think the whole idea of collective proprioception as the next level of research, really. I mean, because it's, you know, how do you move from the individual, which is what I was looking at, to then the collective. And I talk about that somewhat in my lit review when I'm talking about the different levels of learning. So yeah, yeah, that's a really interesting concept. And there's part of me that believes that if we as communities could engage in dialogue regularly, that we would begin to develop that collective proprioception, and that it would, you know, I think that I'm going to speak about the US culture, but you know, we need a little bit of collectivism in our thinking, that we're way too individualistic, and there needs to swing a little bit more towards, you know, collectivism. And of course, you know, people, you know, I can just hear it, you know, in political circles, that's socialism, it's communism, but you know, it's not, it's community. Or as Lowell said, it's citizenship. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Alexander, for that, those comments. We're down to the end of the session, but I thought we could take one more question. And if you're not getting your question answered, Marty will get a copy of the questions and she'll be back in touch with you. So Cecile, you had a comment and or question. I just want to give you an opportunity to ask or comment on what you were commenting on. I felt like there was a question in there, but I wasn't sure what the question was.
I'm in the process of forming it. Marty, what a great job.
Oh, thanks, Cecile.
Wow. Reading your dissertation and hearing you today was just really a profound experience. One of the elements that came up in my reading, but most of all today, was when I was an undergraduate and graduate, the idea of values kept coming up. And Sid Simon did this marvelous piece of work with values clarification.
Mm.
And I was an observer in many of his sessions because of my own course of study, and was assigned to do the analysis of what had transpired. And what I'm hearing in you is a kind of transformative change of, I don't want to use the word perspective, but the kind of change that some people might align with the idea of values.
Mm.
And I don't want to put a label on it because I don't want to limit it. But it seems to me that for those people that look at adult development from shifts in values to the all-encompassing view, these elements become critically important that you're bringing out. They sound very simple, but we've been at this for millions of years. And we're still not sure of what we're about. And I think Kagan's idea of constructive development and all of that is very critical, because I think, as with so many other areas of our lives, are becoming conscious and making a choice as to who we will be is a very critical element. It doesn't just happen.
Yeah.
Just want to, and I guess all of that to say, keep on.
Cecile, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, Marty, this was awesome. I think we probably could talk for another hour. At least there's that much interest, but I do think we covered most of the questions. Just thank everybody for attending.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And you'll all get a link to the recording in case you want to share it with someone. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye, everybody. Have a good day or
Bye,
evening.
everyone.
Thank you.
So Deanna,
Yeah. Hold on.
Um,
Hold on.
okay. Bye, Nancy.